I think that the original Spellforce game is one of the best games that I would never recommend that people play. The 2003 title developed by Phenomic Games is such an ambitious idea that it's even more saddening how often it just ends up falling on its face the majority of the time. See, the main idea behind it was blurring the lines between a party-based RPG and a small-scale asymmetric RTS game. What makes this failure of a game even more jarring is the fact that the original Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos came out more than 2 years prior to Spellforce, and already had a much better story and gameplay flow than Spellforce ever reaches. Despite this, Spellforce still manages to feel like a genuinely forward-thinking game that would end up inspiring several cult classic titles and ultimately resulting in the 2017 release of Spellforce 3. I've said this already, but I absolutely feel the need to enunciate it. You shouldn't feel the need to go play this game unless you're genuinely interested in following the history of the game series as a whole. By modern standards, it just doesn't feel like a good game to play, due to a multitude of factors. The art hasn't aged very well, the gameplay moves incredibly slowly, the UI is a train wreck, difficulty balance is a joke, and the character writing is questionable at best. Despite all of this, the game manages to establish a unique world lore, a surprisingly interesting plot twist, 6 playable RTS races, an interesting worker system, and one of the best feelings of grand adventure that I've ever experienced in an RTS. So, instead of encouraging you to attempt to slog through the rough parts of this game yourself, I hope that by me sharing my own experiences with the game in the context of 2020, you'll have a chance to see the corner of a shining gem underneath all the mud. My name's JB Jet, and this is a retrospective on the original Spellforce, Order of Dawn, and its 2 expansions, Breath of Winter and Shadow of the Phoenix. I can't imagine how you ended up being led to my video, but if you're somehow watching this and have never seen or heard of Spellforce, then I wouldn't be too hard on yourself, because the series has gone under the radar for the vast majority of the gaming community. Their claim to fame as far as game sales go is a measly 100,000 game sales within the first year of launch, which is pretty sad compared to the millions of sales for games of the time like Warcraft 3 and Dungeon Siege, while falling under the same general genre of RPG/RTS appeal. This could possibly be explained at least a little bit by the fact that the developer was based out of Germany, and they were not even able to pull off a simultaneous release in both Europe and America, which would inevitably hurt sales in the long run. Thankfully, the development team was small enough that the resulting sales were just enough to keep it afloat and lead to the release of 2 expansion packs, as well as a sequel. But after the second game also struggled to find mainstream success, the company was eventually bought by EA and worked on several browser games before being shuttered in 2013. In 1997, the founder of the studio, named Volker Wertic, happened to be from one of the old teams at Blue Byte that made the first couple Settlers games, a relatively popular RTS-based game series that is still going strong today, somewhat, although there's precious little information I could find on the development history of the original Spellforce game. The fact that the game took 7 years to complete from its first inception can say quite a lot about how the game started to push the boundaries of what was possible and sane at the time for video games. In summary, the game's a 21-ish map-long adventure where you play as a rune mage summoned by the Grand Circle Mage Rohan. I specified the number of maps because the game is pretty odd in that some maps have multiple main quests occur in them, and others have multiple return trips to earlier areas and side quests, so there's entire maps that can even be skipped, and if the player chooses not to complete some of the side quests, then they just might not even go to those maps. Each of these maps would end up taking between 1 to 4 hours to complete, with the entire original campaign taking me 45 hours to complete. These maps could then further be broken down into RPG dungeons and RTS maps depending on the nature of the forces under your command. Although most of the time RPG maps would end up morphing into RTS maps at the halfway point, kind of blending the genres, I think I'll start by focusing on some of the good parts of the game, and the sheer customization of the main character is definitely a highlight. You can start by choosing from 3 preset characters, which will meet the main archetypes of fighter, archer, and mage, or you can choose to create a custom character where you determine the exact look, skills, and attributes for your avatar. While the attributes are pretty traditional and do things like constitution raising your health and intelligence increasing your mana regeneration, skills on the other hand are quite unique in the way that they've been implemented into this game. See, they act more like character levels, where a higher level of light weapon skill will allow a warrior to equip better weapons and better martial skills, or how life magic will allow you to cast progressively better healing spells and buffs on your allies. What makes this different is how most of the skills are grouped into categories like elemental magic versus dark magic, and you can only raise the subset skills up to the maximum level of the category skill. Take for example an elemental mage and how they have to first put a point into the elemental magic group before they can raise the level of their fire magic to the same max level provided by that category group. But this encourages players to pick 1 or 2 categories and spell groups to focus in, since leveling several categories and spell types on the same character, by the end of the game you'll most likely only be able to max around 5 skills in total, and a jack of all trades would just end up being too weak. The game also comes with a weird implementation of an attribute block, where your character needs a minimum level of a corresponding attribute to a skill before you can level that skill up to a certain point. While these systems seem really odd and convoluted at first, over time it makes more sense why they were created in the first place, in order to encourage players to focus their efforts into one specific type of character like melee, ranged, or spellcasting, in order to maximize the strengths of that character and hopefully have a good enough build to beat some of the late game challenges. In essence, this allows the player to create a jack of all trades if they wanted to, but will inevitably punish them for spreading too thin, like most games that allow for such a wide array of character development, by never meeting the same standards as someone who focused their character in a single pursuit. Your main avatar can then attempt to minimize their weaknesses by developing a group of heroes to follow them in battle. They come with preset attributes and skill charts that the player can't really modify, since these hero characters are picked up via runes and essentially act more as items than they do as customizable party members. Since the heroes use this weird rune system, they don't really level up like traditional RPG companions, and instead you'll pick up progressively higher level companions as you go through quests and maps of higher difficulties. They can be slotted into the main character's rune board screen, which unlocks more slots over the course of the game and allows you to use these stronger heroes as you end up earning them. Likewise, on the same rune board, you can update which worker runes you have slotted, which will increase the level of each building and unit they create on the RTS maps. The hero runes do a really good job of indicating what kind of character they will result in, with the skills and attributes easily identifiable in the tooltip, but it took me a really long time to realize that the worker rune level will actually correspond to the strength of your troops, since this is never really represented anywhere, and the strength of your units is much harder to tell at a glance since their stats are never actually represented in-game. This then brings us to the diagrams page of the character sheet, where you can place any building, schematic, or unit production plan into your hotbar for the RTS portion of the game. Yes, that's right, all of the buildings and units available during the RTS portion of the game are based upon random drops from enemies, quests, treasure chests, and merchants in order to flesh out your options for late game units on most races. The game does give you access to most of the basic resource gathering buildings and weak units during the main quest, but most of the powerful late game creatures, buildings, and upgrades are locked behind side quests and merchants of all things. Technically, you could probably beat most of the maps by just using the basic conscripts, but that's like limiting yourself to basic ghouls in Warcraft 3 instead of teching up to the cool crypt walkers and abominations. While this implementation of loot-based RTS components is pretty weird in theory, in practice I found it motivating me to do just a little bit more exploring and side quests, since there was no telling if I would find a really cool building or unit to use on the next map. And many of these optional buildings or units are actually quite fun to use, like the elven foresting buildings that will literally plant these giant sources of unlimited wood for you to chop, or the corresponding large headquarters for each race that will allow the player to create the race's titan, whether it be the mighty griffin, a treant, a spider matron, or even a balrog. The story behind all this room-based character stuff is the idea that you're actually a summoned hero yourself, that the Circle Mage Rohan infused with enough magic to support yourself independently from the summoner. This allows you to access the ancient monuments of the old Circle Mages in order to summon more heroes, workers, and units, although you can only do so momentarily, unlike the Circle Mages who made you. What makes this all the more amazing is that several years in the past, the mages of the Circle once attempted to create a great magical connection and essentially achieved magical godhood, but ended up failing and splintered the entire world into floating islands only connected by several magic teleportation doors. As such, the main character is slowly collecting the runes and diagrams created by old Circle Mages in order to summon the heroes and armies from before the Shattering. All in all, it's a pretty good excuse why every map is basically an island surrounded by gloopy water on all sides, and they get to use portal doors to transport you to new maps by using loading screens. I mean, it makes me wonder whether the story came first or the game implementation came first and they just built a story around it in order to explain the weird map development that I can only assume makes everything easier to piece together from a technical side standpoint. On the other hand, the existence of these easy map borders and loading screens allowed the developers to create some truly massive maps that end up feeling surprisingly natural. If only the natural looking maps were actually fun to play on. Throughout my time with Spellforce, I found that the majority of the maps were actually quite interesting geographical productions, which felt like they could actually exist in real life. The farmlands and small villages were reasonably open and spacious, with grand rivers and bridges breaking up the landscape, while the mountain passes and paths force you into linear tugs of war with the enemy. Every map has several paths in between any start point and end point, with secluded caves and outcroppings popping up along the main path, leading to 100 different nooks and crannies and random dead ends to go explore and find loot. The only problem that this runs into is the vast majority of these paths end up forcing the player to backtrack several times across the map in order to clear everything. A completionist attitude, which is highly encouraged by the numerous side quests and loot chests that you can find behind each of these dead ends. The reason this starts to become a big problem is the fact that every time you cross the map, it can take between 3 to 7 minutes, depending on how many winding corridors your main character has to cross on their journey. I eventually came to a point where I would just send my party back to a corner of the map and then literally get up from my computer in order to start making dinner or do some chores around the house, as I waited a full 5 minutes for my characters to just get to the point where I could do anything with them again. Near the end of the game, I ended up putting around 6 skill points into the boon specialization just to unlock a spell that increased the movement speed of nearby characters, and that was worth it, just based on the amount of time it saved. Based off the way the geography always felt pretty fitting to me, I think the problem with the system lies more in the movement speed of the characters than in the size of the maps, and possibly one of the most fitting additions to the game would be a time control aspect like in city builder games, so that I could just skip to the next important task or quest instead of watching my characters join the cross-country team. Many of the pacing problems caused by the map structure are then made even worse by the introduction of RTS elements, which often resulted in the developers using large set-piece terrain style that made everything take just that much longer to travel across. Additionally, the large number of units that you can end up controlling will make movement take even longer, since many of your characters will end up getting stuck on one another as the pathfinding attempts to take every unit along the shortest possible route to the endpoint. This would often lead to some funny situations where I would just try to let my army ball up as large as possible right outside the enemy aggro radius before going into battle, in order to make sure that my entire army didn't walk in one at a time. This small little scenario also happens to be a great example of the RTS components of the game as a whole. Around 90% of the maps in the game happen to include the RTS components at least at some point, so it's not something you could theoretically ignore if you didn't want to do those sections. And the gameplay during those parts is just as slow as the walking speed in the game. Battles can take several minutes to complete as both armies attempt to chip away at giant health pools, and hero characters like your avatar and the enemy generals will often survive minutes of your entire army just focus firing on them. Every RTS section starts with your hero clearing a small area of enemy scouts before activating a corresponding race monument. Then, the game has the audacity to make the resource gathering buildings cost the resource that they collect, and starts you with 0 resources of any type, which forces the player workers to slowly gather the first 50 or so resources on each map before they can even begin any real production of that resource. To make it worse, resource buildings are both drop-off points as well as efficiency multipliers, which means that the first 50 resources that you collect in order to even build a resource camp will be even slower than the standard gathering rate as you begin to get farther in the mission. And after setting up this initial resource gathering camp or two, there's a real conflict of interest, since you can then either spend your slow resource gathering rate to build a starting army, or focus on building up your worker infrastructure as fast as possible. In most cases, the answer is to build up your infrastructure first, like in most games, but the fact that the enemy will periodically send out scouts to determine if there are enemy bases around, and your hero alone might not be strong enough to snipe those scouts fast enough, can become a real problem. This scouting mechanic is cool because in other RTS games I've played, the enemy always seems to know where you are no matter what, and will send out attacking forces at set time markers in the game. In this game, however, the attacks will not begin until a scout notifies their home base that you're in the area, which results in the fact that the enemy attacks when they finally discover your existence can be a lot harder to deal with than in other games. This all encourages a very defensive style of play for me, as there were several instances in the game where I simply could not take on the enemy army with my own and hope to win. Instead, I would often have to set up massive walls of towers along one side of my base while my army focused on taking out the enemy base attacking me from the other direction. And sometimes even that wouldn't be enough, as tough armies could often beat me even at full strength under a field of towers, as I attempted to tower push my way into enemy territory. In some of these instances, it might be the case that your character and builder levels just aren't up to the task for a specific map, but I would still find myself feeling underleveled and weak on most of the mainline quests that I undertook, as I would push my army in and maybe kill 1 or 2 buildings before the enemy would ball up and force me out of the base until I could reach full power again. The worst part of this is that all the enemy troops work based off of respawn timers, which would often pump out entire armies while you're still fighting them, as well as most bases having at least one mini-boss style monster that can 1 to 2 shot most of your frontline fighters. All of this comes together and mean that while the scouting system can help your base stay relatively safe for the first couple minutes when the enemy hasn't even found you, once you start attacking their bases, the game quickly dissolves into massive wars of attrition as you build up army after army and try and break through the enemy defenses. Now, if you haven't played the game before, you might just be looking at this situation and assume I'm terrible at RTS games for some reason, or assume I set the difficulty too high, but I have to promise you that this game actually happens to be very hard even on normal difficulty for all of the wrong reasons. Take for example the clip that I'm playing right now, where I have a group of 40 units along with my main character's focus attack a single lich at the end of the 9th mission of the game. And despite the fact that he only has 3 to 4 adds with him, he is able to tank my entire army. So it's not like I can just attempt to snipe the key quest mobs and continue on with the game. You're also highly discouraged from adjusting the difficulty because the difficulty slider doesn't have any effect on the health and damage of enemy mobs, and instead simply increases or decreases the rate of monster respawns. This change could make the current mission you're struggling on just a little bit more possible, but lower monster spawns will also mean that you grind out less experience and have an even greater difficulty on the later missions in the game. And as someone who's been able to beat Warcraft 3, StarCraft, and even the Spellforce 3 campaigns on some of the harder difficulties, the fact that Spellforce Order of Dawn is so difficult to me feels like an outlier for the genre. Instead of building a single death ball and quickly rolling through the entire map, many of the harder maps would involve rolling battles where I replenish my entire army up to 10 times on a single map just to try pushing through one of the set piece enemy bases. And all of this is made significantly harder due to the UI choices for the game, both visually and technically. See, the RTS genre has developed a standard of design around the idea of the attack move action, where it is taken for absolute granted in every new game on the market, but that wasn't always the case for older games, and in the case of Spellforce, the implementation is just bizarre. Unlike most RTS games that have a separate section of the screen which houses buttons for all the different options with your units, Spellforce requires you to remember the hotkey inputs for every action you have your army do, to include the default control right click for attack move. This starts to get buggy, however, when you realize that the aggro radius for any of your units on attack move is only like a 5x5 block of space. So half of your army might begin fighting while the other half just passes by the enemy units. Likewise, for some reason my main avatar would not participate in combat via attack moves, which left them in a precarious situation the first couple times before I understood what was happening. Then, after your army has made contact with enemies via the attack move command, they'll also give up their attempt to move to the end location and instead remain in the area that they first encountered enemies. Because of this, I found the best practice was to just specifically target a weak enemy at the front of their lines in order to get the group in contact, and then let the AI take control of the majority of the group that was already in the mosh pit. But even then, this plan met problems, since any unit told to target an enemy will stop moving towards that direction once the enemy is dead, leading to lines of strung out reinforcements that keep stopping halfway to the battle. And of course this is made even worse by the ever-present slow walking speed, and everything just ends up spiraling out of control until you realize that reinforcing your army mid-battle won't be a sustainable tactic, unlike in most RTS games. There's also a slew of other problems, like the fact that you can set a unit to follow another unit, but you cannot specifically tell the unit producing monuments to target units for rallying flag, which became really annoying for myself. Then there's the problem where using the control number keys to set unit groups in this game does technically work, but you're limited to 6 groups at most. You can't number key production buildings, and sometimes the button setup works really finicky and can misread your inputs. All this comes together to make the RTS component feel somewhat modern in its setup, but frustratingly broken, like it's the first attempts at a new command design for the genre, despite it being several years older than other games that had already made attack move an industry standard. Despite that, the German developers' attempts at innovation came together a lot better on the racial design and balance side of things. See, one of the unique aspects of the Spellforce RTS portion is the way it implements workers by assigning them to specific roles in each building. Say if you make a human woodcutting station, you can then assign up to 5 human workers to become even more efficient woodcutter artisans that will chop down wood faster than all your other workers. Likewise, most of your buildings like forges and temples, which allow you to produce more complicated units will require you to man them with 1 or 2 workers in order to enable the effects of those buildings, thus allowing your monument to start summoning those more complicated units. At the end of the day, the idea that the monument is the only building that can create new units can become kind of frustrating, since it slows down overall unit production and it prohibits strategies that attempt to backdoor the enemy or increase unit production like traditional RTS styles. Even though it is kind of an interesting thematic choice based off of the Rune Warrior idea. On the other hand, the game also implements some interesting UI choices in order to bridge the gap between the RPG and RTS side of things. Instead of tabbing through your units in order to find a skill that you want to use, when you select units, a set of appropriate quick actions will open in a drop-down menu from one of your hero characters. What makes this cooler is that clicking on enemies will highlight all of the offensive abilities you can use, while clicking on your own character will open up a list of defensive and healing skills for you to use. Near the end of the game, this made controlling a group of 6 heroes a lot easier to use than the standard skill system from Warcraft 3, and generally made targeting specific enemies or allies a lot easier, since you could make sure you were focused on the right one before triggering the action instead of after. The series as a whole would end up carrying this tool forward, but it's definitely something that I wish I saw more of in RTS games outside of the Spellforce trilogy, since it's one of the most forward-thinking UI choices that the game ever created. Unfortunately enough, of their game design choices ended up failing the game as a whole, resulting in one of the most frustrating game experiences I've seen without being totally broken. Part of this might be my fault, since I chose to play as a healing mage and ended up being forced into 6-minute long battles where neither me nor the enemy were really at risk of dying in order to progress. But according to the forums, anyone playing a ranger type character is in for an even worse time, since the main character will never target monsters automatically, making them just about useless in most big fights. And even if you took the easy route and chose to make a warrior character, I could only assume that it would still be really frustrating at times on any single avatar maps, since you wouldn't really have access to any good healing spells or abilities, since there are no potions in the game. The same factors that made my main character such a weak one-on-one duelist made my late-game armies almost unstoppable, as I just threw out wave after wave of full heals to my entire army. But even that might not be enough if the game just decided that I was underleveled, since I never spent any time farming the spawn camps as I went through the campaign. While it definitely feels good to have your strong and weak points, the whole setup for the game kinda broke down when I made it to the second to last level and basically have to skip an entire map worth of XP because the spawners were broken on the map, which of course led me to resort to using terrible underleveled elven characters on the final map that couldn't even kill my enemies, and led me to advance on the final base of the game with an army of unlimited towers and workers. The game has this weird habit of breaking itself, forcing you into unwinnable situations, and then presenting you with just enough of an equally terrible answer, like, are you willing to try and tower rush the final battle in the game? The final level wasn't even the worst time I was pushed into a situation like this, since on the Rift level it asks you to make an orc base and battle your way into a valley infested with demons. Easy enough. But then once you've gotten to the eastern side of the map, all of the demons end up waking up and trashing your home base, supposedly leaving you stranded to build a troll base on the eastern side. And that would have been thematically cool if I hadn't made it to this point without any of the troll worker runes that allow you to build their stuff. Instead, I realized all I could do is hope that I could make it with an army of 20 orcs and a couple heroes back through the map while escorting an ice mage that needs your help to get to the other side. After several attempts and about an hour of trying to fight back and forth across the valley, I found out that since my main character was a hero that could basically never die since she just healed herself, I could just walk to the other side of the map, drop aggro on all the demons when I got out of the valley, and the Ice Mage would just follow me while invincible, since they decided main story characters couldn't die. Then I found out that the locked chests at the very beginning of the map had a troll worker rune in them, like I was just supposed to know that the chests would unlock as soon as I killed the Devil General, teleport back to my main base, open the chests, equip the rune, and teleport back to the east side to fight my way through with the Ice Mage. I don't even understand what they were going for with this map, and it's weird situations like that that kind of make the game confusing at times. But at the same time, a lot of those gimmick maps that cause the bugs are some of the funnest situations to play, like in the Breathing Forest, where the entire map is just a game of cat and mouse as you run away from a giant tree ant who's mad at you for stealing his jewel, and guide him into the enemy bases to have him destroy them for you. Or the Mulandir map, where roaming Medusa monsters will wake up nearby gargoyles on the map if they see you, so you have to get through the map without alerting them. Admittedly, some of the gimmicks end up backfiring on them, like the Run Zergling Run maze at the beginning of the Night Whisper Dale map that I ended up getting so frustrated with, I just face-tanked the whole thing and ran to the other side. But the sheer quantity of weird situations and unique mechanics really kept the game from feeling repetitive as I set up my 20th base in almost the same way. After the halfway point, it feels like every map had at least one little twist or situation to deal with, like setting up a defensive force to help your allies in the northern wind walls, assaulting the gates of a giant undead necropolis in the Howling Mounds, retrieving a wayward paladin's missing gears since he's the only one who can damage the last boss in Whisper, helping the people liberate their land and giving you resources on the God Wall, setting up the assassination of a general in Forlorn's Hope, setting up a purely defensive base to survive the endless waves in the southern Godmark, and even dealing with an interesting final boss fight with several phases and just a party of 6 heroes. Some of these were just simple scripting, but some of them really forced me to fundamentally change the way I play for a map. Take for example Grey Dusk Vale, where you start with a simple defeat the enemy bases scenario as you build up your town and push your way to the middle of the map, where a human settlement is under siege by an undead lich. After you ask them to open up the main gates to the settlement, it starts off the second half of the map where an endless horde of undead will keep spawning with no way to stop them. Instead, you have to fight your way to 4 cave tunnels and station forces there in order to kill off any skeletons that try to walk to the other side. Then, you have to start fighting your way through the canyon in the center of the map that's filled with high-level undead, which will keep respawning unless you keep the weak skeletons from getting through on the other side of the map, where you posted the guards at the cave entrances. This makes you split up your forces for one of the few times in the game in order to try and protect the 4 cave entrances while still keeping a large enough force to fight through all the stronger monsters in the center. It was hard, but hard in a good way, like it was a surmountable challenge that could be beat by outplaying it, not because it felt like I wasn't supposed to win. And this is why I feel like Spellforce did best, throwing you into these weird and wacky RTS situations with a set of tools and saying, hey, you can beat this however you want to do it. Sometimes those tools would break and I would have to brute force my way through the game with things that obviously didn't intend to be happening, but at least the game had the balls to try something different from the standard mold. Similar to the gameplay, Spellforce takes some interesting chances with its story and lore, so if you want to play through the game blind, I'd recommend you stop watching here because I'm about to start getting into more spoiler territory. I would call the story average at best since the presentation as a whole just fails to pull off the major twists that the game throws at you, most often due to the wild voice acting choices in the game.
I advise you to greet with the name of the Emperor, stranger. His light glows brighter than the lights of the gods.
You mean the shine of his gold?
Ah, I see you understand. But watch your tongue. Here in Empiria, one does not hesitate to swing the executioner's axe.
The dwarves all happen to have a different accent.
This blade.
Netarv's beard, an earth blade.
Can it be used?
You need a handle so you can hold it. I can make you one if I get the right material.
What do you need?
Red adamantium is the only metal that can be attached to an earth blade.
Half of the characters are melodramatic in the most awkward ways.
No, don't touch the shackles. There is a magic spell.
That sounds familiar. Wait, what came next? Ah, of course.
And sometimes even the writing itself is just poorly designed.
Here in Sky, everything centers around fighting and surviving. But the people have good hearts, and nowhere you will find more honest and upstanding people.
But without a doubt, my favorite voice actor has to be the main villain for the Shards of Time arc of the game.
Speak up! Why do you unnecessarily want to prolong your suffering?
Your force will do you no good. From me you will discover nothing.
Captain, have everyone here searched? Everyone, do you hear? I want that fragment, even if I have to devastate this entire country. Torture this rabble if necessary. They have their chance. Bring me the fragment, or Briar will bring me your head.
All in all, a lot of this can be explained by the fact that it's an English adaptation of a German game, but it all comes off in such a B-roll matter that sometimes it feels like they weren't even trying to keep it serious. But at the same time, the intro cinematic is this 5-minute long action sequence of an epic battle between two mages that ends up literally tearing the world apart as they fight midair while trying to gain control of an ancient spellbook of power. But of course, none of this scene makes any sense the first time you play through the game, and you don't actually get the context for anything that happens until you've completely beaten the original campaign. See, the story of Spellforce Order of Dawn kinda just flops if you tell it from the main character perspective. The mage Rohan ends up summoning you at the beginning of the game around 8 years after something called the Convocation, which you see in that intro cinematic, then leaves in order to deal with an invasion of Iron Men along the eastern side of the human lands. Meanwhile, your avatar is ambushed by the evil hooded mage from the intro cinematic. He reveals his plans to you in the typical evil mastermind type of way, so you set off to catch up with Rohan and attempt to save him from an assassination attempt by the Dark Mage. Along this journey, you end up joining the Order of Dawn and defeating a mercenary group called the Iron Fist that's been terrorizing the area, but are unable to stop the assassination of Rohan in time. Just before he dies, you're able to catch up with him, and he tells you to search for Hokan's legacy, which is supposed to be strong enough to stop a circle mage like the villain. Thus you begin the second third of the game, where you slowly take control of the dwarven armies and push back the never-ending ranks that serve the necromancer Hokan and his students. You eventually meet with the spirit of Hokan, who you exchange the Mask of Belial with for information about his greatest tool, the Phoenix Stone. Supposedly, the stone was hidden in the Circle Mage capital of Mulandir and was created by tapping the energy of the All-Fire Phoenix, making an item of unimaginable power. After defeating another mercenary group led by the maniacal mage Meklan, who tricks you into putting together the fragments of time, you finally retrieve the Phoenix Stone and return to fight the Iron Army and the Dark Mage. In the final third of the game, you join forces with the Dark Elves, and one of your friends from the Order gets captured and eventually killed, but I never even really recognized the character or knew why he was important in the first place, so that death scene kinda blew it for me. Then you finally fight your way through all the Iron Hordes and confront the big bad evil guy who laughs maniacally and says you're too late before jumping into a time portal several decades to the past in order to change history and take control of the Convocation. Oh yeah, and you find out that the Dark Mage was actually young Rohan the entire time. Now that you know that the Dark Mage is young Rohan, the whole story should make a good bit more sense. If I pieced it together correctly, in terms of his life timeline, it looks a bit more like this. Rohan was born only slightly before the Convocation and amassed great power in a short time in order to challenge the other Circle Mages for control of the Convocation. Old Rohan stopped him from destroying himself though, which is why young Rohan and old Rohan are the only two Circle Mages to survive the Convocation. Over the course of 8 years, old Rohan attempts to piece back together the world by creating portals between all the remaining islands in the world, while young Rohan spent his time studying how to go back in time and succeed in taking control of the Convocation. Thus, when old Rohan hears about the coming Iron Hordes, he recognizes his coming death and accepts his fate at the hands of his younger self, since he in turn killed his older self a long time ago. The Rune Warrior that you play as is then tasked on behalf of the old Rohan to go get the stuff that he knows that the younger Rohan will need in order to go back in time, which is why the main character is doomed to basically fail in the story. So obviously at the end of Spellforce 1, young Rohan ends up teleporting 700 to 800 years into the past, where you can see his development over the course of Spellforce 3, as he realizes that death and destruction is not the right path to power, and eventually achieves immortality as a Circle Mage in order to stop younger Rohan from killing himself during the Convocation. And with it all laid out like this, it sounds like a really cool story, complete with a never-ending time loop paradox. The only problem is that this story never manifests in a good way, since Rohan is kind of both the villain and the protagonist of his own story, but not the story that the player really deals with. Instead, the player ends up fighting against 100 different side minions and weird offbeat villains for 1 to 3 maps before you inevitably beat them before moving on to Spider-Man villain number 35. I think a big problem for the main story is that there's a real lack of context for it. Like, what's the point of the Order of Dawn? I know Rohan created them as a weird pseudo-police force, but the game never really presented me with any reason to like or affiliate myself with them, despite naming the entire game after them for some reason. A couple of times throughout the story, you're presented with a side character to ask questions, like stories about the old world, the Convocation, and some of the old Circle Mages that died in the blast. As I neared the end of the game, I revisited Darius in one of the earlier starter towns just to hear some of the lore, and it was pretty engrossing for me at the time, but I know that I definitely listened to him at the beginning of the game and just couldn't find any reason to care what he was saying because I didn't have any context for the characters he was talking about at the time. But once I did have the context of the wars between Hokan and Ram, the Archlich and the Demon King, and when I started to understand the descent into madness that the Circle Mages slowly took, when I realized that the power of the All-Fire Stone was kind of a source of all the problems in their world, then, and only then, did the world start to cement itself into a more concrete vision in my head. And frankly, a good part of my understanding of how all the lore links together comes from the forums on the game, rather than the actual game presentation. It's all there in weird little snippets and half-stories that you can piece together if you put in the work, but that's still asking a lot of the player to be interested enough to finally see the silver lining. Another weird juxtaposition is the thematic conflict of the lore with the stories the game decides to tell. In the lore, the world is destroyed for X reason, and the only mages in the world powerful enough to even make that mistake were the Circle Mages, because they relied on some external power that they harnessed from the Phoenix Stone. Everything seems to have a logical cause and effect process, with the mages literally devolving into an arms race trying to get the upper hand on the others via magical improvements and their equivalent of scientific evolution. On the other hand, the game likes to throw some weird stories that never really seem to have an explanation behind them, like a giant ent which guards a random stone in a forest with his life. In the expansion Breath of Winter, I think the best example of this is the story of a giant who tries to steal the dwarf's secret to fire immunity. The dwarf ended up cutting off the giant's head, yet the giant continued to chase down the dwarf for his secrets because his greed ran so deep that even death could not stop it. So on one hand, mages slowly grow in power over the course of centuries, with the necromancer Hokan gradually learning how to summon stronger and stronger undead until he finally learns how to imbue blades with a life of their own. And on the other, we've got a giant whose greed was so strong that he survived a beheading and has haunted the dwarves for several millennia. It just feels like they're trying to mix Tolkien fantasy with Brandon Sanderson fantasy, and it gets really muddled in what's actually possible in this world. Like, the background history writer and the side story writer were working independently without caring how the world logic might be affected. All of this would end up getting slight improvements in the first expansion, Heart of Winter, which is about the plans of the Fiel Darg to take over the world. The story is basically a standalone campaign that took me 25 hours to complete and doesn't really interact with the main storyline in any way. It follows a new rune warrior that was summoned by a couple of other rune warriors named Lena and Grim in order to stop the oppression of humans by the Ice Elves that have invaded the southern swamplands. In order to accomplish this, you're tasked with bringing back the heroes that originally freed the humans from the orcs' slave camps in the area. What actually happened is the heroes ended up in a weird love triangle, which you solve by letting the female get murdered, then enslaving both the brothers before coming back to the refugees. And for some reason, when you return to the refugees, they're entirely okay with seeing their heroes being stripped of any free will and used as slaves in order to inspire the humans to fight with you against the Ice Elves. I don't know. This part of the story kind of fell through a little bit for me, but all in all, it's just a setup to show you some small character hints about the rune warrior that summoned you named Grim. Throughout the first couple maps, he's attacked by the Ice Elves for being a sun worshipper, and in many cases shows a penchant for warfare, even above most rune warriors. When you finally try to liberate the Ice Elf camp in the swamps, he murders the High Priestess there and releases one of the Fiel Darg that was imprisoned in ice. This trick cues the second major arc of the game as you flee the fire-worshipping Dark Elves that have been unleashed in the valley, and make your way to the frozen capital of Tirganak. You then spend a couple of maps tracking down the dwarf's secret to fire immunity, and coming into contact with the Headless Giant and several stories of eternal battlefields. You then end up finding Darius the cartographer again in Tirganak, who you can ask some questions about the background lore on the game, but this portion is mostly just you preparing your forces to bring the fight to the Dark Elves. This offensive involved your sacking of the Sun Elf capital, then delving into the shadow-infested abyss in order to recover the only sword that can kill a Fiel Darg, as well as the final battle to weaken the Ice Dragon and lift a spell that has severed his bond with the Ice Queen. The only real notable character arc in this section is the inclusion of a Dark Elf general named Craig, who's abandoned his people and provides you with the information to divide the city's factions and conquer the city in order to quell their bloodlust. He then goes on to help you kill Grim at the end of the map, which just felt like a really good token character to establish the fact that not all Dark Elves are totally evil, only mildly pragmatic. As for the gameplay in the first expansion, it felt pretty different for me because I ended up building a warrior as my main character, before expanding their skill list to include light spells as well, in order to create some more of a paladin type of character. All in all, it felt pretty good, as I got both the unkillable nature from the healing spell side of things as well as the hard-hitting nature from the warrior side of things, and most of the difficulty from the game felt like it was intended instead of resulting from my character build in the first campaign. They end up keeping away any towers from you until you get near the end of the campaign, so that it's harder to farm experience during the first couple of levels. Admittedly, I think that the decision to not give you towers is more due to the nature of you being supposed to get repeatedly beaten out of your base as you make a several map-long exodus while building momentary defense forces against the Sun Empire before retreating. This map where you build up an orc base and several elven bases only to get absolutely wrecked multiple times by the Sun Elves probably wouldn't be possible if they gave you towers. And I think the thematic power of this moment gives them enough justification as to why they wouldn't want to deal with that problem if someone tried to tower up on the map. There was a noticeable bump in difficulty when you start to go on the offensive against the Sun Elves, but they also give you towers at this point, so you also get a great opportunity to farm a couple of levels if you start to feel underpowered. It was also around this point in the game that I realized that whenever your character dies, they lose a noticeable amount of XP, which may have explained why my character grew so weak towards the end of the first campaign, since I assumed death had no real consequences in this game. Maybe this was covered in the tutorial along with any other obscure commands I never remembered, like rotating buildings by using the control key plus the scroll wheel, which became very useful once I finally figured out that existed. But despite this, I found the expansion a lot easier to play through, which may have to do with just getting used to the unique game flow for the first Spellforce game. Over time, I found that the standard strategies that I might try and employ on any other RTS just didn't seem to work the same in Spellforce, and adapting to that change was challenging considering all the modern gamer privilege. In most Blizzard RTS titles, it always seems to make sense where you should go next and what resources to expand to. In Spellforce, on the other hand, it can often be a puzzle to just figure out where to even start getting resources to start your army. Take for example the map Winterdeep, where you would assume that the Dwarven base should use the iron ore deposit that doesn't look like it's guarded by any enemies, which is what I ended up trying my first time on the map. What you wouldn't assume is that there's an enemy camp along the cliff immediately to the right of the iron deposit that has a good line of sight to that resource and will aggro across your base to go kill your miners. I doubt the developers intended on this happening, but regardless of intention, I ended up deciding the best way to tackle this map was to destroy the skeleton camp on the backside of my base, guarding a moonsilver deposit, then mine the late game resource, while ignoring the iron resource for most of the basic troops from the dwarves. It was only after I had a strong enough army to deal with the ghost elves on the ridgeline that I could even start mining the iron and building a better army instead of just elites. None of this makes sense from a logical approach, but throwing common sense out the window often seemed the best answer in this game. Even on more typical maps where your resources aren't booby-trapped from the beginning of the mission, it would often become more efficient to tower up the front of your base just to hold off the first couple waves of enemy attackers, before you could build up a real army to even try getting an expansion. And that was often the turning point on the maps, whether or not you could get your stack up to a death ball before they threw something you couldn't deal with at your towers. The line between being able to take a fight and just losing all of your units in Spellforce always felt really thin compared to most games. Due to the size of the armies and the way the AI is built in the game, most of the time it felt like any micro I tried to put in had very little impact, and instead, the rigorous application of healing spells was the deciding factor between success and failure. And even when you had reached the critical mass to survive and defeat a wave without the help of towers, it becomes more of a question of how quickly can you chew through the waves as they never stop respawning, while you constantly drain resources. Just trying to manage the fact that on some maps you can only afford to make 2 or maybe 3 full-sized armies, and it's easy to resort to mass towers which are basically invulnerable with a couple of workers to back them up. Over time, I started to learn whether I could take on a level 14 wolf or a level 20 skeleton, but even then, the game knowledge would get thrown in the air every once in a while when I found out that level 14 trolls can very easily be some of the most dangerous enemies in the game. Sometimes I would find it was perfectly fine to fight against cat armies several levels above my main character, but then other times a similar level dark elf might whoop my ass. All of this could be solved by simply letting us see the stats on characters that you have selected, but no, not only can you not see an enemy's health pool, but you can't even look at the stats on your own units. Every step forward came with one step back as I found a battle rhythm and saving before I met a new enemy type, just to see if there was something I could even hope of killing before reloading and trying something else. Of course, when losing an army means you lost both limited amounts of experience per campaign, but also limited amounts of resources on each map, and suddenly save scumming seems both reasonable and mandatory if you don't want to go insane playing this game. This all throws us into a really awkward situation, since your main character is technically immortal, since they can technically just respawn whenever they die from the nearby runestones. But at the same time, if you resort to abusing this function more than once every couple hours, then you would quickly find yourself underleveled in the game and find it even harder to progress. Since the enemies don't start respawning until you've opened an RTS monument at the beginning of a map, you can theoretically go around the maps and destroy all the spawning buildings before they even activate in order to make a map easier. At the same time, if you were to do this too many times during a campaign, you would lose out on all the experience points you were supposed to get from destroying endless waves of enemy attacks. Likewise, if the enemy waves get the better hand of you and overwhelm your base, then they would eventually stop when they've taken care of the monuments, leaving you with most of your base destroyed and no armies, but never technically kicked out of a map via a failure screen. I've never let myself get pushed into that situation, since I've always thought it was better to reload a save and deal with things in the first place, but I can only assume it would be a long, slow process to try and take back control of a map after your base has been wiped out. Theoretically, you would be able to keep the resources in your bank as long as you stayed on a map, but that also means that most players would think it's better to just stay on a map and push through the tedium rather than risk losing all the stored up resources that you might have due to the sunk cost fallacy. And since the difficulty meter only changes the spawn rates on our enemy RTS sections, turning it down will only make the RTS sections slightly easier, while not affecting the difficulty of the RPG sections at all. Everything comes together to make an already very slow game even slower, and in the case of less experienced RTS players, I could easily see them turning maps into 5 to 10 hour long ordeals if they made the wrong choices early on. All of this is made even more difficult to make your way through when you also factor in the many bugs that plague the game. The most common one that I encountered was the fact that whenever the game goes into cinematic mode, it changes the resolution of the game, which isn't really an issue up until the point you get back into gameplay and the resolution never changes back, leaving you with a game screen that doesn't match up with any inputs or clicks you try to do. In order to fix this, the easiest way that I was able to find was to simply save the game and completely exit the program before trying to reload the save, which would often take me out of the game every few minutes in particularly cutscene heavy sections. Otherwise, every so often it seems like a trigger or another would end up breaking, like how on the map Shalaran near the end of Breath of Winter campaign, the enemies would spawn, but never ended up being sent to my base, which led to an easier time in this particular situation, but a harder time on the last couple maps, since that left me underleveled for the endgame. Or how, near the end of the game, an important quest mob that was supposed to drop a key just ended up going missing, and I had to reload an earlier save after spending 40 minutes looking for a body that I might have missed somewhere on the map. It's all these tiny things that don't end up making the game totally unplayable, but do lend an air of tedium to the game that kinda just drags out your playtime in all of the wrong ways. If for some reason you decide to go back and play the game yourself, I'd recommend downloading the spawn correction patch that you can find on the Spellforce forums, which can help fix a problem on the Steam version of the game where on some maps the spawners will trigger when you start playing the campaign, so that by the time you reach the map is already so full of monsters that it will crash the game because the map no longer has any room to place more monsters on the map. And while there are fixes for all of this, and it didn't crash all that often, it was enough to make the game feel genuinely unpolished, even though this is supposed to be the Platinum Game of the Year style version of the game. Given all the problems I encountered with the game, I don't think I would have put in the effort to finish even the first campaign if I hadn't played the third game of the series first. I open this critique with the idea that I don't think that most people should play the game, and I stand by the fact that I don't think it's worth putting in the time investment to see a couple of cool things unless you have a vested interest in the series as a whole. Those few tidbits of lore and context that the game occasionally teases players with, along with the historical origins of the game's more refined systems in Spellforce 3, were enough to string me along, but there were multiple situations in the game that just frustrated me to no end, since the game really felt as though it didn't respect my time. Even just the tiny things like how making enough workers will drain your monument efficiency to the point where if you try to make 2 bases at the same time, the rate you can pump out the first couple of workers will quickly slow to a crawl. This meant that a lot of the time I wasn't limited by resources or my ability to put workers to new tasks, but rather that I might have to spend several minutes just waiting for production queues to finish, since there was no real way to speed up the process, as my army slowly trickled in one man at a time. But every once in a while, the game would throw me a real curveball when the difficulty curve felt just high enough to challenge me, but also easy enough to work my way through up until the tedium of another wait hit again. Because of this, I think that my favorite map in the entire game happens to be the Abyss, where instead of enemies spawning and attacking your base via easily towered approach routes, the enemies are shadows who are constantly walking around your base and only become hostile for short periods of time before fading back into their ghostly form. I loved it because it forced me to constantly focus on different things as I tried to get enough workers, working production to get resources, while also babysitting my hero group that were just strong enough to take on the shadows 1 or 2 at a time, long enough for me to set up towers around my scattered pockets of buildings. Once I got up towers around all my resource areas, the game went back to normal as I built up an army and scoured the map, but that first hour of constant combat as I tried to set up a base that wasn't constantly at risk of burning down happened to be one of the most frantic and entertaining things I've experienced in an RTS. Unfortunately, the map ended up turning into me towering up several hardpoints in order to complete a ritual since I was so underleveled due to the broken Shalaran level. So my relatively weak army and heroes weren't really the dev's fault in this particularly difficult instance. But that map really marks the crowning achievement of the first expansion, since it led to some of my favorite scenarios in the entire game, as they threw genuinely interesting gimmicks and rule benders into the way you played through almost every single map. Not only did they feel good both thematically and gameplay wise, but they also tied everything together rather neatly with a simple yet well developed story. Unfortunately, the ending ends up getting kind of botched up, which left me with a sour taste in my mouth that took me a good time to get over and recognize the strengths of the expansion as a whole. See, the final boss looks like a cool set piece, but the fact that it's separated from the main gameplay area, it means that only characters that can hit it are ranged characters. And to make it even more frustrating, the RTS race for the map are the dwarves, which do have a ranged unit, but their range is so short that they can't even reach the dragon unless you find a way to drag him to the edge of his side of the cavern. And even then you have to watch out for a mass AoE freeze attack that you just have to hope doesn't catch your healer. There's a convenient chest in the cave that you can hide your ranged heroes behind so he can't target them, but the fact it felt like I had to use exploits to deal with the final boss instead of just having a fun melee fight with a dragon and my army was kind of disappointing at the end of an otherwise fantastic expansion. The second Spellforce expansion, Shadow of the Phoenix, ends up following in the footsteps of the original campaign much closer than Breath of Winter in a way that I think leads to its detriment. My opinions of the campaign might have been spoiled by the fact that I was already 70 hours into the game, and the remaining 27 hours started to drain on me, but the second expansion ended up really reminding me of the original campaign both in theme and in gameplay. Most of the maps ended up feeling like giant tug-of-war battles of attrition, while all of the RPG maps kind of feel like linear paths with a couple of spin-off paths for one side quest or another. What the final expansion does well though is adding at least 2 building types and units for each race that kind of spice up gameplay, but generally just happen to be situationally useful. The first building for each race gives you the option to spend 60 food in return for a pack of 10 weak units it refers to as a swarm. I think that the units are supposed to respawn back to 10 over time as long as one of them is left live based off the tooltip text, but in practice I never actually saw them respawn and mostly just used it as a food dump for some easy meat shields. Likewise, at the siege buildings for each race, you can build a moving siege tower, which happens to kind of suck versus the spawning buildings, but is actually really useful for taking care of the many insta-kill blade towers that you have to outrange in order to destroy. All of these buildings and units came with their own malls and sounds, which I would have taken as a given for an RTS expansion, but was a welcome surprise after the lack of any real changes in the Breath of Winter. The enemy also acquired several new units, including their own siege units that you'll want to target down before they nuke your towers, as well as a unique enemy type called the Mummy, which happens to be highly resistant to physical attacks but weak to anything magical. The introduction of the new undead type, a new lizardmen army type, both Arabian and Greek-style human enemies, and the evolution of the blade armies was an interesting addition compared to the Breath of Winter, but didn't really have much of an effect on the gameplay as a whole. The story follows either the main character from the base game with the Phoenix Stone, or the avatar from the Breath of Winter with the Shadow Sword. If you choose the Phoenix Stone character, you basically are asked by your old friend Darius to help him find the source of dark magic coming from the south, which results in you finding out that Hokan used the Mask of Belial you gave him in order to come back to life, and then stole the blood of a god to bring the old circle mages back to life and serve his bidding. Along the way, you kill some bandit camps, save a dryad from Shelob, run away from the Emperor until his daughter kills him for you, and travel through several blade and undead-infested battlegrounds on your way to save Darius. The story changes a bit if you're playing as the Shadow Sword character, since you're technically working for Hokan for the antidote to your curse up until you meet the Dryad, but the gist is the same as you make your way through the second half of the campaign. Thematically, the final cutscene where you release the Phoenix and permanently kill Hokan along with the other circle mages is pretty important in terms of game lore and long-term effects, but the way it all comes across in game is kinda just disappointing. The only real memorable gimmick in the entire campaign was a single map where blade forces could turn lizardmen spawners back on after you had turned them off, but the solution was as simple as killing all the blades first before dealing with the lizards. Likewise, on the RPG side of things, there's an entire city map with several side quest paths available in order to complete it, that you can pick and choose which ones you want to deal with. And I don't know, I just felt really unimpressed with the map designs for this expansion as a whole, since it accomplished its goals for spectacle with high-level armies and heroes clashing together, but the gameplay was always basically the same by this point in time as I slowly cleared my way through the maps. Even the army composition side of things kind of slowed down near the end of the game, as all I really had to do was survive long enough to build up an army, put on my Aura of Eternity in order to buff all my units, and then go for a rampage until my mana run out, and I had to wait for another push. Was it pretty to look at? Yes. Did I feel like a powerful light mage at the end? Yes. Did I actually enjoy playing the last couple of maps? Not really. After 90 hours of building the same snowball effect over and over, I just wanted to see the ending and get a sense of finality to it all. There were actually 3 side maps in the campaign out of the 14 maps in total, which you don't even need to step foot in order to beat the game, similar to how there's the Stoneblade Mountains in the original campaign. Thankfully, despite skipping all 3 of the optional maps in this campaign, I still found myself adequately leveled throughout the entire experience. And for the first time in the game, I was able to equip new worker runes as soon as I got them, instead of the usual 2 to 3 maps later like in the first couple campaigns. Also, this campaign does a good job of letting you progress in whatever way you want to, like the puzzle dungeon map called the Clockwork Crypt, where you can either choose to brute force it, or take the time to work out all the puzzle games and avoid combat entirely. As far as rewarding you for putting in the effort to finish the game, I'm half and half about the whole thing considering the storyline. On the one hand, I thought the characterization in the campaign was some of the best out of the entire series, like how well they managed to make the Emperor into a understandable but hateable character. But on the other hand, the ending still ends up feeling really rushed, and as the conclusion to the game as a whole, just a major letdown. They threw in several token characters that you know from the previous campaigns to tie it all together, like Urias, the Spider-Man, Flint, and the Dark Elves Craig and Shane, which I thought was a good touch, in addition to making the main Lordom characters a literal god, which was kind of cool to see them tie in between Breath of Winter and Shadow of the Phoenix. But all the context for the people you meet is just lacking, and that's how the game as a whole kind of feels to me. Mildly entertained, sometimes frustrating, but mostly just disappointed by the end. The game has some incredible ideas that it tries to meld together, but between the bugs, the pacing, the presentation, and the balance, it all just fails to work things out. It makes sense why Spellforce became a sleeper hit, with a small but devoted fan base that was willing to work around the problems, but what's really the biggest shame is that the same habit of grand aspirations but lack of polish is a problem that still seems to plague the modern Spellforce releases to this day. I can't imagine how good the games might come out if they were created by a larger, more AAA style company, but I also think that a company like that probably wouldn't take a chance on these strange genre bending attempts. Instead, the game rests firmly between the indie world of solo developers and small teams and the bigger gaming world where Blizzard and Epic throw thousands of employees at a problem until it's a polished turd. This is possibly the best example of what a B-rate game should be. Grandiose in both aspirations and size, but in most ways better used as a proof of concept that if anyone was able to take this idea and really polish it, you could find the gemstones inside the geode. I both loved and hated my time with the game, and however much I'd like to go straight into the sequel that also had a disturbing lack of critical media, I think I'll probably need a palate cleanser before I dive back into the wonderful world of Spellforce. Thankfully for people that did end up falling in love with the game, there's a lot of replayability options in the game as a whole. Not only could you try playing through the game as a different main class, which would be interesting since you don't get to see many of the late game abilities on the rune heroes, but the game also comes with a built-in free game mode where you could just explore maps and all the... Wait, correction. The first time I heard about the free game mode, I just assumed it was the same area as the Order of Dawn campaign without being broken up by the campaign quests. But after some more research, it might as well be its own standalone campaign. It basically tells the story behind the Dark Elf Night Song and how the events transpired that led to the plotline in Spellforce 2 Shadow Wars. I think for the sake of continuity, I'll probably do a deep dive into the story behind the free game mode when I do a Spellforce 2 video, because I know if I tried to shoehorn it into this video, I wouldn't be able to do it justice. What's weird about it all is that despite the small amount of information and FAQs you can find on the original campaigns, I can't even find a single walkthrough for the free game mode, which leaves it as an equally intriguing void as far as information goes on this series. If an entirely different fourth campaign doesn't interest you after the other three, there's also several mods available for the game that try to improve the visuals, audio, balancing, and even a few fan-made total reworks for the campaign, if you look in the right places. Either way, I think the game probably rings loud and clear as a call to nostalgia, but for those of you that might be thinking about digging in for the first time as a modern consumer, the experience is going to be rough. Do you like long video essays on video games like this one? At the end of each of my videos, I like to recommend a couple of channels that I think are some of the best for video game critiques. So today you should totally check out Video Game Dunkey. He's a well-known channel, but I want to give him a shout out because he actually has some reviews up for Spellforce 3, in case you want to hear more about the later installments in the series. Second, if you want to watch one of the greatest character analysis I've ever seen, go check out the Philosophy of Kreia over on Period's channel, linked down in the description below. If you like the video, think about subscribing so that you get notifications when I put up a new essay. Also, thank you to Strategy Joe and Pretty Normal Media, who recommended that I pick up a better mic and encouraged me to pick up the better quality audio that you're enjoying right now. If anyone else has recommendations for what you think I could do better, please leave a comment, because I do genuinely read them all. Thank you, and I hope to catch you again in my next vid.